In the summer of 1943, Adolf Hitler launched what he believed would be Germany's final chance to regain the initiative on the Eastern Front. The target was a massive Soviet bulge around the city of Kursk, and the plan, Operation Citadel, relied on Germany's best remaining armored forces to break through Soviet defenses in a decisive tank battle. But the Red Army was ready. Through intelligence, reconnaissance, and months of preparation, Soviet forces transformed the Kursk salient into the most heavily defended battlefield in history. Miles of trenches, minefields, anti-tank guns, and layered defensive belts awaited the German attack. When the offensive began, German tanks advanced into a killing zone where momentum quickly vanished. The battle reached its climax near Prokhorovka, where thousands of tanks clashed at close range in chaotic fighting that shattered German armored strength. Although losses were severe on both sides, Germany could not replace its destroyed tanks, trained crews, or experienced officers. When the offensive stalled, the Red Army immediately counterattacked, pushing German forces permanently onto the defensive. Kursk marked the last major German offensive in the east and ended any realistic hope of victory against the Soviet Union. From that point forward, the initiative belonged entirely to the Red Army, and it would never be reclaimed. Real quick, please like and subscribe to help our channel grow. Now back to the story. The bulge that begged to be attacked. By the spring of 1943, the German situation on the Eastern Front had stabilized after the disaster at Stalingrad. Field Marshal Erich von Manstein's brilliant counteroffensive in February and March had recaptured Kharkov and created a relatively stable front line. But one feature of that front line dominated every German operational map: the Kursk salient. A salient is a bulge in the front line, territory that projects into enemy-held areas, creating a situation where the defender must hold a longer perimeter while the attacker can concentrate forces at the base of the bulge and potentially cut it off. The Kursk salient was massive, extending roughly 120 miles north to south and projecting about 90 miles westward into German-held territory. Inside this bulge, the Soviets had concentrated substantial forces that were vulnerable, at least in theory, to a pincer attack from north and south that would encircle them. To German commanders, the salient looked like an opportunity. A successful double envelopment would trap Soviet armies, inflict catastrophic losses, and potentially create conditions for a broader German offensive. It was the kind of operational victory Germany desperately needed. Something to restore momentum, demonstrate continued German military superiority, and buy time for the political settlement Hitler still believed might be negotiated. But there were problems with this thinking, and several German commanders recognized them immediately. The salient wasn't just sitting there by accident. The Soviets knew it was vulnerable and had months to prepare defenses. Any German attack would be obvious from kilometers away. The element of surprise was essentially impossible, and Germany's armored strength, while still formidable, was no longer overwhelming. Every tank committed to Kursk was a tank that couldn't be used elsewhere, and every loss would be difficult to replace. General Heinz Guderian, the Inspector General of Panzer Troops, was blunt in his assessment. The attack was pointless. He argued that Germany's new Panther tanks, which Hitler was counting on to provide a decisive edge, needed more development time, and that committing them to a predictable offensive was wasteful. Better to husband strength, let the Soviets attack first, and used Germany's still superior tactical skill to defeat Soviet offensives before launching counterattacks. Field Marshal von Manstein agreed that delay was dangerous, but believed a quick strike in April or May, before Soviet defenses were fully prepared, could succeed. But Hitler kept postponing. He wanted more Panthers ready. He wanted the new Ferdinand heavy tank destroyers deployed. He wanted every possible advantage before committing. Each delay gave the Soviets more time to prepare. By the time Operation Citadel finally launched on July 5, 1943, the Soviets had transformed the Kursk salient into a fortress. The greatest defensive preparation in military history. Soviet intelligence knew about Operation Citadel almost from its inception. The Lucy spy ring in Switzerland provided details of German planning. Soviet reconnaissance aircraft photographed German troop concentrations. Partisans reported rail movements. Interrogated prisoners confirmed attack dates. By late June, Soviet commanders knew not just that an attack was coming, but when it would come, from which directions, and with approximately which forces. Marshal Georgy Zhukov, coordinating overall Soviet strategy, made a critical decision. Let the Germans attack first. The Red Army would defend in depth, absorb the German offensive, and only when German strength was exhausted would the Soviets counterattack. This required building defensive positions unlike anything seen before in the war. The Soviets constructed 8 defensive belts, 8 successive lines of fortifications stretching back over 100 miles in depth. The first 3 belts were the most heavily fortified. Soviet engineers laid over 1 million mines in the northern face of the salient alone. Anti-tank ditches, sometimes 15 feet deep and 20 feet wide, stretched for miles. Trenches formed interconnected networks that allowed defenders to move under cover. Pre-sighted artillery positions could concentrate fire on likely German approach routes. Anti-tank strongpoints studded the landscape. Positions containing multiple anti-tank guns, often the excellent 76mm ZIS-3 field gun used in the anti-tank role, or dedicated anti-tank weapons like the 45mm M42. These positions were dug in, camouflaged, and supported by infantry. German tanks advancing across open ground would face fire from multiple directions simultaneously, with Soviet gunners having pre-ranged their weapons to key terrain features. Behind these fixed defenses, the Soviets concentrated massive mobile reserves. The Central Front, defending the northern face of the salient under General Konstantin Rokossovsky, had over 700,000 troops and 1,700 tanks and assault guns. The Voronezh Front, defending the southern face under General Nikolai Vatutin, had similar strength. Behind both fronts, the Steppe Front under General Ivan Konev held another 500,000 troops and 1,500 tanks as a strategic reserve. In total, the Soviets had assembled over 1.9 million men, 5,000 tanks and assault guns, 25,000 artillery pieces and mortars, and 2,900 aircraft to defend the Kursk salient and conduct the planned counteroffensive. It was the largest concentration of military force in human history to that point. The Germans, by contrast, committed about 780,000 men, 2,700 tanks and assault guns, 10,000 artillery pieces, and 2,000 aircraft. They had technological advantages. The new Panther and Tiger tanks were superior to most Soviet armor in direct combat, and the Ferdinand tank destroyer's 88mm gun could destroy any Soviet tank at long range. But they were attacking into defenses that negated many of these advantages. The Northern Pincer, Model's grinding advance. The Northern Pincer of the German attack was commanded by Field Marshal Walter Model's Ninth Army. Model was cautious, methodical, and thoroughly professional, qualities that served him well in defensive operations, but which made him question the entire Citadel concept. His doubts were well-founded. When Ninth Army attacked at 5:30 a.m. on July 5th, they advanced into a maelstrom. Soviet artillery, forewarned of the attack timing, began a massive bombardment of German assembly areas just as the assault began. The bombardment disrupted German formations before they even crossed the start line, though it wasn't as devastating as Soviet accounts later claimed. The Germans had dispersed their forces precisely to reduce vulnerability to such fire. The initial advance seized the first Soviet defensive line in heavy fighting. Model's infantry cleared trenches and strong points, while his armor pushed forward. But progress was measured in hundreds of meters, not the kilometers needed for a breakthrough. Every field contained mines. Every ridge concealed anti-tank guns. Every village became a fortress, requiring house-to-house fighting to clear. The new Panther tanks, which Hitler had delayed the offensive to deploy, proved mechanically unreliable. Transmission failures and engine fires disabled Panthers at alarming rates. Some units lost more tanks to mechanical breakdown than to enemy fire during the first days of fighting. The Tigers and Ferdinands performed better mechanically, but were too few in number to decisive on their own. And the Ferdinands lacked machine guns for self-defense, making them vulnerable to Soviet infantry in close combat. By July 6th, Model's advance had penetrated about 6 miles into Soviet defenses, roughly the depth of the first defensive belt. Soviet reserves were already moving forward to reinforce threatened sectors. German casualties were mounting, particularly among infantry and combat engineers, without achieving the breakthrough that would make those casualties meaningful. Model pushed forward for 4 more days, committing his reserves to maintain momentum. By July 10th, Ninth Army had advanced about 12 miles at most and was fighting in the 3rd Defensive Belt. But they were exhausted, and Soviet resistance was stiffening rather than collapsing. The breakthrough that would allow German armor to race into the Soviet rear never materialized. Instead, Model's forces were locked in attritional combat, the worst possible situation for an army that couldn't replace its losses. Hitler called off Model's attack on July 10th. Ninth Army had failed to break through, had suffered severe casualties, and faced fresh Soviet reserves being fed into the battle. The Northern Pincer had been stopped cold. The Southern Pincer, Hoth's race against time. The Southern attack, under General Hermann Hoth's 4th Panzer Army and Army Detachment Kempf, initially made better progress. Hoth had concentrated his strongest formations, the 2nd SS Panzer Corps with the elite Leibstandarte, Das Reich, and Totenkopf divisions, into a powerful spearhead aimed at Prokhorovka, a small town whose capture would open the road to Kursk from the south. The 2nd SS Panzer Corps had the best equipment Germany could provide. Tiger tanks with their deadly 88mm guns, the newest Panthers, and large numbers of Panzer IVs upgraded with long 75mm guns. The SS divisions also had more trucks and equipment than regular Army units, giving them greater mobility and sustainability. Hoth's attack on July 5th hit the Voronezh front's defenses with overwhelming force at the point of attack. The SS Panzer divisions punched through the first defensive line and kept moving, using their mobility to bypass strong points and continue the advance. By July 7th, they'd penetrated about 15 miles and broken through the second defensive belt in some sectors. But the advance was consuming strength at an alarming rate. Every mile gained meant running a gauntlet of anti-tank guns, mines, and air attacks. Soviet ground attack aircraft, the famous Il-2 Sturmovix, attacked German armor columns relentlessly. Even when German tanks destroyed Soviet defensive positions, they lost vehicles to mines, mechanical breakdown, or the occasional Soviet tank concealed in ambush positions. General Vatutin, commanding the Voronezh front, recognized that the 2nd SS Panzer Corps posed a real threat. If Hoth's armor reached Prokhorovka and broke through there, they could turn north behind the main Soviet defensive lines and unhinge the entire southern defense. Vatutin requested that the Steppe Front's 5th Guards Tank Army be released to his control to stop Hoth's advance. The 5th Guards Tank Army, under Lieutenant General Pavel Rotmistrov, was one of the most powerful mobile formations in the Red Army. Over 800 tanks and assault guns organized specifically for counterattack operations. Stalin approved its commitment, and Rotmistrov's army began moving toward Prokhorovka. The stage was set for the largest tank battle of World War II. Prokhorovka, the myth and reality of the greatest tank battle. On the morning of July 12, 1943, the 5th Guards Tank Army launched a massive counterattack against the 2nd SS Panzer Corps near Prokhorovka. What happened next has been mythologized beyond recognition, but the reality is dramatic enough without embellishment. The Soviet attack aimed to hit the 2nd SS Panzer Corps while its divisions were still assembling for their own planned advance toward Prokhorovka. Rotmistrov's plan was based on closing to point-blank range as quickly as possible. Soviet T-34 tanks were outranged and outgunned by German Tigers and Panthers. But at close range, their 76mm guns could penetrate vulnerable areas like side armor. Speed and numbers would overwhelm German technical superiority. Around 8:30 a.m., hundreds of Soviet tanks crested the low ridges southwest of Prokhorovka and charged toward the German positions. The Leibstandarte Division, holding the main defensive line, opened fire at ranges exceeding 1,000 meters. Tigers and Panthers began destroying T-34s before the Soviet tanks could effectively return fire. But the Soviets kept coming, accepting terrible losses to close the distance. At closer ranges, the battle dissolved into chaos. Tanks fought at ranges measured in tens of meters. In the smoke, dust, and confusion, identification became difficult. Some Soviet tanks rammed German vehicles when their guns couldn't penetrate. German tanks fired at point-blank range, their shells punching completely through T-34s. Aircraft from both sides strafed and bombed anything that moved. Later, Soviet accounts claimed that 1,500 tanks fought at Prokhorovka, and that the SS divisions were effectively destroyed. Neither claim was true. The actual number of tanks engaged was around 800 to 900 total from both sides. And while the 5th Guards Tank Army suffered catastrophic losses, over 300 tanks destroyed or disabled in a single day, the 2nd SS Panzer Corps remained combat effective and actually inflicted heavier losses than it received. But Prokhorovka achieved its strategic purpose anyway. Hoth's advance was stopped. The momentum that might have carried 2nd SS Panzer Corps through to operational objectives evaporated in the grinding battle. German units were tired, damaged, and unable to continue offensive operations even though they held the battlefield. More importantly, events elsewhere made continuing the offensive pointless. On July 10th, Allied forces had landed in Sicily, threatening Italy. Hitler needed to transfer forces to the Mediterranean, and Soviet counteroffensives were beginning to threaten other sectors of the Eastern Front. On July 13th, Hitler called off Operation Citadel entirely. The counteroffensive, from defense to attack. The Germans had failed to achieve any operational objective at Kursk. They'd penetrated Soviet defenses but hadn't broken through. They'd inflicted casualties but hadn't destroyed Soviet forces. And now they faced the inevitable Soviet response. On July 12th, the same day as Prokhorovka, the Red Army launched Operation Kutuzov against the German positions north of the Kursk salient, targeting the Oral salient. 3 Soviet fronts attacked Model's exhausted 9th Army and neighboring formations with overwhelming force. Within days, German forces were in full retreat, abandoning Oral by August 5th. On August 3rd, the Soviets launched Operation Polkovodets-Rumyantsev against German forces south of Kursk. The Voronezh and Steppe fronts, supposedly weakened by defensive fighting, attacked with massive tank formations and drove toward Kharkov. German forces fought desperate defensive battles but couldn't stop the Soviet advance. Kharkov, recaptured with such effort by Manstein in March, fell to the Soviets on August 23rd. The Red Army didn't stop. Through the fall of 1943, Soviet forces continued attacking along the entire southern sector of the Eastern Front. They reached the Dnieper River in September, crossed it in October, and recaptured Kiev in November. The Germans fought skillfully and inflicted heavy casualties, but they were always falling back, always abandoning territory, never able to regain the initiative. What Kursk meant. The Battle of Kursk and the immediate Soviet counteroffensives that followed marked the definitive shift in the Eastern Front. Germany would never again launch a major strategic offensive in the East. From Kursk onward, German strategy was purely reactive. Respond to Soviet attacks, conduct local counterattacks when possible, but always, inevitably, give ground. The losses at Kursk weren't necessarily decisive by themselves. Germany lost somewhere between 200,000 to 300,000 casualties during Citadel and the immediate defensive battles, along with roughly 500 to 800 tanks and assault guns destroyed or damaged. These were severe losses, but Germany had absorbed worse at Stalingrad. What made Kursk decisive was the combination of losses and strategic failure. Germany had committed its best remaining forces to an offensive that achieved nothing. The new Panther and Tiger tanks had been unveiled in an unsuccessful attack rather than husbanded for defensive operations where their technical superiority would be more valuable. Veteran panzer divisions had been ground down in attritional combat, exactly the kind of fighting where German tactical skill provided the least advantage. And the follow-on Soviet offensives demonstrated that the Red Army had fundamentally changed. Soviet commanders were now conducting complex, multi-front operations with skill. Soviet forces could transition rapidly from defense to offense. Soviet logistics could sustain continuous operations over weeks and months. The army that had nearly collapsed in 1941 had become a juggernaut. For the German soldiers who fought at Kursk, the lessons were bitter. They'd fought skillfully, often achieving local tactical victories, destroying more Soviet tanks than they lost. But none of it mattered. Superior Soviet numbers, resources, and operational depth meant that tactical successes couldn't translate into strategic victory. The realization spread through the German army. They could win battles, but no longer had any realistic path to winning the war. General Guderian, who had opposed Citadel from the start, later wrote that after Kursk, the armored force, newly equipped and trained, had lost heavily both in men and in equipment, and would now be unemployable for a long time to come. Needless to say, the Russians exploited their victory to the full. There were to be no more periods of quiet on the Eastern Front. The Wehrmacht would continue fighting for nearly 2 more years, often with skill and determination. But after Kursk, every German soldier knew the truth. They were no longer fighting to win. They were fighting to delay the inevitable. The Eastern Front had become a one-way road, and it led to Berlin. Thank you for watching and listening. We really appreciate it. Please consider subscribing, liking, and even sharing this video.